Hi, everyone, and welcome to the third webinar in this year's Legislative Prep Series. We're grateful to the Education Commission of the States and to the National Association of State Boards of Education for partnering with us to bring you today's webinar. First, a quick cap on where we've been so far in this series. Many of you may have joined us for the first two webinars. You heard state leaders from California and Kentucky, two very different states, very different contexts, share a common vision for how community schools are transforming student outcomes and well-being, and also reflect local needs. Earlier this week, just 2 days ago, Indiana and Washington described their approaches to redesigning the high school experience, including smoother, more structured, supportive pathways to post-secondary and career success. Across these conversations, we hear states expressing the same commitment to great public schools, to engaging and challenging instruction, to improving outcomes for learners. We know that all states want the best for their students, and also that leaders across the country are grappling with a lot of the same challenges: stagnant achievement, chronic absence, growing concerns for youth mental health, the ubiquity of technology, and the persistent challenge of directing resources to the right places so that each and every student gets the education that they deserve. This is our second year hosting this legislative prep series. We're back because we recognize the need for more collaborative spaces like this, where states can share interests and challenges and exchange ideas about what's working in policy and in practice. So today we're going to delve into school funding, an issue that is ever evolving and always a top priority for states. Over the next hour, we will hear about challenges in the school funding landscape broadly. We'll be joined by legislators from Montana and New Mexico who are going to share how they're navigating these changes. It's my pleasure. I'm going to just let us dig in here. I'm going to hand off to LPI Senior Fellow Mike Griffith, who's going to set the stage for today's discussion. Thanks so much for being here. Over to you, Mike.
Thank you so much. So we've got a lot to talk about today. My name is Mike Griffith. I work on school finance issues at the Learning Policy Institute. With us today, too, is Chris Duncombe. Chris is going to be talking about state funding research. What I'm going to talk about in the beginning is what we know and a lot about what we don't know about what's happening at the federal level. Then we're going to have Senator Soules from New Mexico and then Representative Jones from Montana talk about what's happening at their states and some solutions both for state issues and then maybe some things you can learn that they're doing in their state to prep for some of these federal issues. We're going to have plenty of time for Q&A, so let's get started and talk about the federal issues. Just as a reminder, federal funding is small but still important within K-12 school funding. For the 24-25 year, this is an estimated number, but it's about 8% of K-12 funding comes from the federal government, with 44% coming from local and 48% coming from states. Always an important reminder, and state policymakers know this, but I think it's good for everyone else in the audience. The state controls both the state funding and the local funding, in the sense that the state can determine how much locals can bring in, how much they can spend. So at the state level, we're talking about either direct or indirect control about 92% of the funding. So in K-12 education, that's really where the game is. But that doesn't mean the federal funding isn't important. It definitely is. And it ranges greatly. Even though it's 8% nationally, it ranges from 3.9% in New Jersey up to 18.7% in Montana. That's a bit unusual for Montana to be up there. That's normally New Mexico and Mississippi are up there. That might be some residual effect from some of the ARPA or the COVID funding, but it gives you a general idea. The other thing to understand too is it ranges greatly within a state. So there are some school districts that might receive 1% or even less than that from federal funding. There are other school districts that receive 20, 25% or even more from federal. So it can be incredibly important for certain school districts to understand what the trends are and happening because it is such a large source of funding. Also, as a reminder too, I think we tend to think of large urban districts as the ones receiving large amounts of federal funding or a high percentage. That's not always true. It can be large urban districts, but it is just as likely that it's small rural districts and poor communities that receive a high percentage of their funding from the federal government. So it's all across the board when we look at that. So what do we know? What don't we know? So let's start with the unknowns. We don't know which programs and grants have been canceled uh, or reprogrammed by the U.S. Department of Education. We thought at this point we would. Back in July, when we planned this session, we thought we'd know all sorts of things about what's happening at the federal level. Unfortunately, we don't. We're still kind of in a wait and see mode. Uh, what fund, we don't know the funding levels or any guardrails that Congress might put on once they enact the FY26 budget. We'll talk about that in a second. We do have ongoing federal funding, obviously, but a new budget has not been passed. And so we're waiting to learn what that could mean, will mean for schools. Um, and then this question about interagency agreements is some of the functions of the US Department of Education have been moved to other divisions of the federal government. We don't know what that means. Will that mean there's going to be a change in the way the funds are distributed, the requirements under this funding? We know this is happening, but there are also some legal challenges to this. So the question is, when will it fully happen? Will it fully happen? And then what will that mean to states? So unfortunately, we just don't know that right now. Let's talk about some of the stuff we do know. It's a bit confusing here with the federal government because the federal budget runs from October 1st to September 30th, which is different from almost all of your state budgets. There's only two states that have a budget cycle that's the same as the feds. So when we talk about funding, it's from October 2024 to September 2025 was the last budget. The current budget that we're in, the October 25 to September 26, has not been passed, but they have passed a continuation. So in other words, the funding that happened under the previous budget will happen this year. It's about $45 billion in the past year, and we're looking at $45 billion in the current year under the continuation. But the president has proposed a budget for this 25-26 year, the year we're currently in, that would be $38 billion. That'd be about a 15% funding reduction. And the other thing to, I'll keep stressing here is this is just a proposed budget. Proposed budget doesn't mean it's going to pass, doesn't mean it's going to be enacted, but it's a proposition that this could be passed, and if it was, it would result in 15% cut in funding. I think one of the big notes here is that the proposed budget would not reduce spending for Title I Part A. Title I Part A and IDEA, which is the funding for special education, account for about 75% of the federal spending on K-12 education. Those are the two big pillars. All of the other programs account for about 25%. So Title I Part A is not being touched. There would be some reductions, and we'll talk this in a bit, proposed reductions for IDEA special ed funding. Um, but but again, you get an understanding that the two big pillars, one will not be touched, the only other one in smaller ways. It's a lot of the other programs that will be cut theoretically or eliminated. And if the administration's budget were adopted, over 30 different P12 related programs would be eliminated. And here are the programs, again, in the proposed budget that could be eliminated. You can see some things within Title I could be eliminated. Title I's Part C and D could be impacted. But and the other programs, some of these would be reductions, some of them would be complete eliminations. It just gives you a general idea there. And again, if you look, that does not come to 30, but each one of these have subprograms, and that's that 30 number that has been estimated that would be eliminated. So if this were to pass, we could see some pretty large reductions in these programs. But the question would be, A, is this going to pass? And then B, what would that mean for states? So this is the position we're in right now. We just don't know much about what's happening. There's also questions that we've received about different cuts in other programs within the federal government. What would that mean for schools? And again, we're kind of waiting on what the impact for those would be. What we can tell, even in the best case scenario, is there would be flat funding at the federal level at a time that we're seeing all sorts of issues at the state level. So now I want to turn it over to Chris and talk a bit about, since we're unsure about what's happening at the federal level, what is happening at the state level and what do we need to think about in that side um, to be prepared for the upcoming legislative session for you all in January. Chris Duncan is the principal at the Education Commission of the States. Chris has worked with many states on school funding issues. Chris, I'd like to turn it over to you now and then have you talk about what's happening, what you're seeing the emerging issues in states.
Great. Thank you so much, Mike. Really appreciate being here today. And thank you for that overview at the federal level. As you said, I'm going to be shifting to gears a bit to what we've seen at the state level. Education Commission of the States is an organization that serves state education leaders in all 50 states. We've been doing that for 60 years now. And as part of that work, we track legislation in states related to education policy. We do that in 40 different topic areas, and I get to lead our tracking on school funding. And so I was going to share what we've been seeing so far in 2025 that might have implications going forward for 2026. But before I dive into that topic, one kind of overarching trend that we've seen is fewer bills related to school funding in states. Not that we are able to identify every single piece of legislation that gets introduced and enacted in states, but we've summarized 98 school funding bills so far this year. We typically average about 150. And I think some of that, the fewer number of bills is related to a lot of that uncertainty happening at the federal level that Mike touched on. But it's also impacted by a shifting budgetary picture for state governments. NASBO, the National Association of State Budget Officers, released their fiscal survey of the states last month, and it shows a trend of tightening budgets and flat spending when it comes to general fund expenditures. The graph I've put up here is the percent change in general fund spending in state budgets, both total and median, to try to control for outlier states. And you can see going back to 2022, there were historic levels of general fund spending growth, a 16% increase, which was the largest increase that NASBO recorded in their survey in over 40 years. That picture has shifted dramatically now, just a 1.3% increase in total general fund spending growth in enacted budgets for 2026. So states are in a very different financial position than they were a few years ago. And that might explain why we're seeing a bit more limited action in terms of state funding changes. But that doesn't mean that states aren't making changes to their budgets. It just means we're seeing fewer bills and not as many large scale shifts as we have in the past. But there are three trends that we have seen in 2025 that really builds on areas of emphasis for states in prior years that I think will continue on into 2026. And the first is states continuing to enact new funding formulas and transition to more student-based funding models. We saw this in 2022 with Tennessee. Last year, both Colorado and Mississippi enacted new funding formulas. And this year, Alabama adopted the Renewing Alabama's Investment in Student Excellence, or RAISE Act, and which is a large scale change to how they allocate K-12 funding in their state. And I'll go through a little bit more detail on Alabama's funding model in a moment. The other area that we're seeing movement is states changing how they're directing aid that's targeted for specific student groups that are receiving additional services. A lot of states shift the level of funding that they direct to different student groups, but we're also seeing states shift how they identify these students for supplemental aid. And we're going to be hearing from New Mexico Senator Bill Soules to talk about how New Mexico's shifted their at-risk measure targeted to students from low-income backgrounds, relying more on state data than relying on federal data that many other states use. And the last trend that we've seen has been towards state's effort to increase compensation for teachers, particularly starting teacher pay, with states enacting minimum pay requirements in statute. And we'll also be hearing from legislation that was adopted in Montana, the STARS initiative, that tries to better align starting teacher pay with average teacher salaries in districts across the state. So before we shift to those highlights, I did want to dig a little bit deeper into each of those topic areas. I mentioned that Alabama adopted the new RAISE Act. The bill shifts the state to a student-based funding model. And in these models, the state allocates a base dollar amount that gets allocated to every student in the state. And then they weight supplemental funds for students that receive additional services. And in part of doing this legislation, the state has directed $166 million in the first year of implementation to support additional funds for students from low-income backgrounds, English learners, students receiving special education services, students in gifted programs, and for charter schools. As part of going to a student-based model, one of the drawbacks or challenges that states sometimes experience is that while providing a lot of flexibility at the local level, there are some limitations from the state level in terms of accountability and oversight. Alabama included two bodies to have continued oversight of the implementation of the new formula and also to be monitoring student outcomes. They created both a RAISE Act review committee and an accountability and implementation board. The accountability and implementation board is charged with monitoring student outcomes and also reviewing accountability plans that are submitted by districts and can potentially recommend corrective actions if certain schools or districts are not meeting the standards or goals that they set out. So it's a balance of both trying to have flexibility for districts and also having some accountability measures at the state level. So that was the big shift in funding formulas that we've seen. In terms of weighted funding allocations, there's a lot of green check marks on this slide here, but what I'm trying to illustrate is that a lot of the states that have adopted new funding models, I mentioned Tennessee, Mississippi, Colorado, and Alabama, they're targeting funds to a lot of the same student groups. There's some differences in how those dollars get allocated, but largely are identifying the same types of students for supplemental state funds. With a big emphasis on better differentiating funding based on level of service, even within each of these student groups. And an example is for special education services, Tennessee, through their TISA program, has 8 different weighted funding categories based on the student's IEP and hours of direct services they're receiving for special education per week. So really trying to differentiate aid based on the level of services students are receiving. And so that is kind of an example of areas where states have been dedicating support for specific student groups. And the last area that I mentioned, there's been an effort to alter state funding and try to improve funding levels for teachers, particularly around starting teacher pay. States can take kind of one or two approaches for improving teacher pay. One being more of the carrot, which is to provide a financial incentive for districts to improve teacher pay. And that aligns with the example from Montana that we're going to be hearing more about. The other is more of the stick, which is having a minimum or teacher pay requirement set in state law. States can go about these minimum pay requirements in one of two ways. They can have one minimum amount required across the whole state, which is just one minimum pay salary amount, which typically is like $45,000 to $60,000. This is where a lot of states have been enacting bills to create just one minimum salary mark in the state. And both Maryland and South Dakota are two states that are implementing minimum pay requirements for the first time this year. The alternative approach is to have a salary schedule. So this is a range of minimum pay requirements for teachers based upon different levels of experience or their credentials. So hopefully this kind of gives you a flavor of some of the areas that, we've been seeing some state action and change at recently. And with that, and happy to address any of those questions in these different topic areas when we transition to the Q&A portion. I think we'll now dive in a little bit deeper into the work that's being done in New Mexico. And I'm going to welcome New Mexico Senator Bill Soules, who's the chair of the Senate Education Committee. It's wonderful to have you here, Senator. I think you're on mute, Senator.
There we go. Okay, thank you. Thank you. I appreciate it, Chris. In New Mexico, I have to start with, we're a little bit different than other states in that our entire operational budget is on a formula. And so it is not locally controlled at all. It all comes through a formula. But New Mexico has always had an at-risk factor, a multiplier for students at risk. And research shows concentrated poverty in communities are negative factors to student learning. And so that prompted us to have an accurate way of identifying students that are high risk. For decades, like most states, New Mexico identified low-income students using proxies such as Title I and free and reduced lunch data. But New Mexico, like many other states, is also rapidly moving towards universal free meals, which makes the free and reduced lunch not an effective way of determining poverty, as those applications are no longer identified, as well as using census data types of things is not a very good way of determining, using zip codes, for instance, because there are concentrated poverty within different zip codes, particularly in a very rural state that has large areas. This prompted New Mexico to create a modern student-level income-based measure to replace those proxy measures. New Mexico chose to use primarily its own state data, so we aren't reliant on federal data for any of this. And the New Mexico legislature created the Family Income Index, or the FII, in 2021 and used a pilot to see how that data was working. It identifies concentrated poverty at the school level, identifying those shortcomings of free and reduced lunch as a proxy or census-based ones, and provides targeted funding for the state for low income. The particular measures that New Mexico uses are state income tax records, where the Public Education Department submits student information to the State Taxation and Revenue Department to match students with parent and guardian tax filings. And that provides the most accurate data. It comes back to the public ed, not with individual identifiers, but with broader identifiers just by which district students are in. And then that picks up about 69% of all of the students. Then they use public records data that matches to benefits data like Medicaid through the New Mexico Healthcare Authority. That picks up another 16% or so of the students. And then the last ones use a census estimate, but only for those unmatched students. Doing that ensures full income classification for all of the students matches. That's about another 15%. When we went through and did that, it picked up pretty accurate income data for all but 9 students statewide. Not 9%, 9 students statewide were able to get matched through all of that. And so, it's really important that the Family Income Index does not identify each student by their specific household income. It categorizes students into income categories where they will fall. And then based on the number of students in each category, funding goes out to the school district to then be distributed by individual school where the highest needs and poverty are. The legislation that was enacted this last year shifted from the pilot to doing this statewide in the funding formula for all students. And so, so far it seems to work very well and is a much better measure than using a proxy like free and reduced lunch in order to determine poverty levels for the state. And happy to answer any questions about that.
Thank you, Senator. And I think that's a great example of a state not relying exclusively on federal data or participation in federal benefit programs. You mentioned it is a supplement to the state income taxes, but you're also using state data to help identify students. So really appreciate you being here and sharing that example from New Mexico. I'll hand it off to Mike, I think, to take over.
Yeah, and I'm going to introduce Representative Jones, who's been working for years in Montana on school funding. He was both a senator and now a rep, and you're the chair of the Approps Committee. Is that correct?
That is correct. I chair appropriations.
And
Yeah.
so you all had a big success on increasing teacher salaries. And that was one of the big things Chris pointed out, and that's something I hear in a lot of states. Could you kind of talk about that and what you did and why you chose to do it?
So yeah, so I've been doing it for about 20 years now. Montana has approximately 400 school districts, and our challenge is it's a very strong local control state. It's we are formula funded, right, to a base level, and the locals can choose to put up some extra. So we have a formula funding, but the formula funding has an inflation cap in it, and of course, ESSER was causing us a cliff problem, like everyone else, despite admonishments not to use it for ongoing. That seemed to work about as poorly for us as it did in a lot of states. And so we needed to, and we had a low teacher pay, a starting teacher pay problem. Interesting, in our local control state with our 400 independent districts, some really small, 10 people or under districts, and some big. It's all local control bargaining. And who showed up at the bargaining table primarily are your more senior teachers, and their end of the scale was not bad in Montana, especially in the bigger schools. They were actually relatively high. The average wasn't too bad, and we just sucked on the low end. We were some of the lowest, if not the lowest in the country in a lot of spots. And so we tried to address this in the past. You throw money at it. We had a small Teach Act, but we could get the money to go local, but local control never would put the money or wouldn't guarantee the money would go to the classroom teacher. It went wherever they felt it should go. So interestingly, we used our ESSER cliff and our inflation problem as a lever. We said, all right, we need to create a program and we need to get some bipartisan buy-in in order to pass a program. Because if you look at our Republican-leaning legislature, we have a lot of the very extreme right folks that just don't want to vote for Republican at all. So we're going to need some Democrat votes. But we also have a whole group that, including the governor, that's very performance-based, that we're not just going to throw money at a problem. So we decided we had to create a performance-based funding package that would get the buy-in from all these blocks. It had to be primarily state funded because we had a property tax problem that was giving us some challenges. So we created what was called the STARS Act. So what the STARS did is it set up base teacher. Now, we can't force local control to do anything. We don't have to give them money either. So it's an incentive. So basically it said this, look, you will get, and we have what it's called a quality educator payment, which is, it's inflation linked, but right now it's $3,700 per teacher that goes out to every teacher in every school. We said if the base starting teacher pay had to be a minimum of 11 times the QEP or 42,000, and there was a second Mendoza lining there. It had to be, because the bigger schools were already there. It had to be, it began at 60%, but the beginning pay wage had to work its way up to 70% of the average so that it compressed the scale. Because what we had was this extremely wide scale, good on the top, bad on the bottom. If you met this benchmark, and certified you would meet it the first year because you didn't have money. But if you did meet it, then instead of getting $3,700 per teacher, you got double, 2 times the QEP. And so that would, but you only got it if you did it. If you didn't do it, obviously you didn't need it because you weren't paying your teachers. Now, in order to pass this bill, we had to also do some other performance-based things in it. The bill, we've had some student outcome challenges in a number of areas. So this one actually paid for outcomes as well. Half went to the teacher salary side. It pays if you have and we didn't, again with a Republican, and we had to pay for both dual credits on the academic side and for career credits. So basically it said, look, you'll get some additional funding for every student that graduates high school with 15 credits. That's one level. And that adds another, I believe, let's see what it was, $800 to the high school QEP and $600 to the elementary. So a school would get $1,400 for that kid, that graduated with 15 credits. Effectively double that for 30. And then if you get all the way to 60 associate's degree, it's more. But it wasn't just on the dual credit side. It also paid for the stackable career credential side. CNAs, nursing, we didn't care whether you were in a welding shop or not. So the combination of those three seemed to get us enough buy-in. We had to add a housing component for teachers. But effectively what happened then is the teacher pay and the housing support got us some D votes, the performance-based side on both the teacher and we're not just going to throw money at it, the credentialing, kids graduating more, got us the Republican side. And it also forced an alignment between our K-12 system, the Office of Public Instruction, and our higher education system, OCHI, and the Department of Labor, because labor gets to determine, working with business, what is a credential that matters to business, right? And so with that alignment, we were able to pass this package. The vast majority of schools, I think of the 400, maybe it was only 8 that didn't choose to do it, and they don't have to. It's local control. In speaking with them, they were quite happy with it. And again, it wasn't easy to pass. The union did not like the fact we were saying you didn't get money unless you brought your bottom teacher pay up. And well, there's always somebody with a variety of reasons not to take it. But what worked for us is the ESSER challenge, along with an inflation shortfall, allowed us the impetus to design a program that fixed our ESSER shortfall, but it did it in a manner that ensured that the money got to the classroom teacher, especially on the beginning pay side. And it also rewarded those schools that were enhancing student opportunities, whether on the career side or on the academic side. So that's a quick summary of STARS, the House Bill 252.
Thanks so much for that. You are a very local control state. I don't think most people know about you all and the fact that you have elementary school districts, junior high school districts, and K-12 districts. So a student can never move and be in 3 different districts during their academic career. Bit unusual.
It's a massive number of districts, each with their own ability to control. You have a very difficult time using any sort of a stick with them. We had tried just throwing money at the whole system, but what happens is it got worse. The spread between the bottom teacher and the top teacher spread. And so we had to create a scenario that caused both the local superintendents and principals to focus on how they would negotiate at the bargaining table to begin the process of narrowing the gap. Because if you take our biggest schools and you put them on the national scale, on the high end, we're just fine. And the midpoint, we're about in the midpoint, and the bottom sucks. It was just consistent across the board that the local control negotiation, and this is anecdotally me saying this, it seemed to be my wife was the chair of the school board and of the statewide school board association, is largely that negotiators were more senior. And they seem to take much better care of their end of the scale than they did the beginning teacher end of the scale. And so and you get to some of the rural towns, and they just were more interested in other things than putting money into the teacher classroom. Well, now in order to get that chunk of money, you don't get to say you have to prove up. It's you have the right, you have the local control to decide not to receive the incentive.
Great, thanks for that. I think we're going to move on to the Q&A for all our participants. And I'm going to start with a question. We received a lot of questions before the session. They all centered around, one way or the other, what can states do to prepare for possible changes in federal funding, for possible cuts in federal funding. Chris, I'm going to start. I know it's a real difficult question, a real big one, but could you kind of talk about what you think states could do? And then I'd like to move over and talk to the legislators and see what's happening in their states, what they're doing. But we'll start with you with the sort of national overview.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things that state leaders can be looking to do in this time period of uncertainty. The first is kind of basic, but I started my overview about the tightening financial positions that states find themselves. And I think states can try to provide some stability to districts in the funds that they're getting from the state, while they're navigating the uncertainty at the federal level. You certainly don't want to be compounding the challenges that local districts are having by also cutting programs at the state level for certain services for students. So I think the first thing is just to try to provide some financial stability with state dollars. The other thing that I think states can be doing is looking to identify their K-12 priorities, funding priorities, and or processes for for identifying those priorities from the public. We don't know that there will be block grants. We don't know if there will be shifts in how federal aid will be distributed, but the discussion certainly has been an emphasis on state decision making and state flexibility. So going through the process of identifying what are your biggest funding priorities if there are increased flexibility in federal funds, so that you're prepared to hit the ground running and not caught off guard if all of a sudden federal programs really change their requirements and it's really just a state decision in terms of how dollars get allocated. So I think those are two very kind of basic things that states can be doing right now to prepare while we're in this period of uncertainty.
Great, thanks, Chris. Senator Souls, can you talk about what's happening in New Mexico, how you all are preparing for possible changes?
Certainly. And as everyone knows, there are changes not just in education, but across the board. And I think New Mexico, very forward thinking, set up a new interim committee, of which I'm one of the co-chairs, called the Federal Funding Stabilization Subcommittee, which makes recommendations to our finance committees about where we ought to be looking at major changes that are coming. As most of you know, a lot of the changes are a couple of years down the road, but New Mexico doesn't want to wait till then to see what happens and trying to be proactive in a lot of ways. As a result of that committee, we've actually had two special sessions this summer where we backfilled money that's already been cut, and we're able to mitigate some of those in some of the SNAP benefits and things of that sort. Particularly in the education areas, most of the federal funding that we get in education does not currently look like it's in serious jeopardy. A large chunk of it is impact aid. We've got quite a number of our students and districts that get money because of the tribal lands that are in those districts. That does not seem to be in jeopardy at this point. Most of the Title I is not in jeopardy. Most of the special education funding is not in jeopardy. We are concerned about the changes in the agencies and who do you call with questions about whether something counts or doesn't count. With that institutional knowledge at the Department of Education shifting somewhere else, we worry is going to be lost as to whether you're following the rules right or how do you get questions answered. And that's one of the bigger concerns. The place where we probably see the biggest impact are the ones that are more around the cultural issues. The ESL funding, the English second language. New Mexico has a very large number of second language learners where there's federal funding coming into the state and districts for those students, also rural. And we know that changes to the SNAP is going to affect lots of our students. 40% of our students are living at or near poverty. And so that'll have major changes on schools, making sure that the children have the food and societal types of things so that they can take advantage of the education. Same thing, the changes in Medicaid funding is going to have large impacts for lots of our students and children. And so very concerned about those going forward. That committee, though, keeps a close eye on things. I feel some of my role on the committee is being in the education realm is to keep reminding people that the federal changes are not an impact to the budget. They're a change that affects people in the state of New Mexico. And we need to keep that focus that this really is about how it affects people, not just how it affects a budget.
Yeah, really good point. And on impact aid, this is one of those things that If you're west of the Mississippi, you know what impact aid is, and it's a big deal to you. If you're east of the Mississippi, you might wonder what that term even means. And
I could explain that a little more if you'd like.
well, I think you did a nice job of summarizing it in the sense it is for it's for
Mostly
federal,
tribal and federal lands.
yeah, and then a little bit military too, but yeah, it's primarily that. So, but Representative Jones, do you want to talk about what you all have been doing to prep for this in Montana?
Sure. So when I was in the Senate, I was chair of finance and claims. In the House, I've been chairman of approps. So we've been on a journey I've always called from being reactive to proactive for a period of time. And so here, a few years back, we formed a committee called the Modernization and Risk Analysis Committee. Its whole purpose is to look, we say 20 years out, and that's probably a further horizon than you can have, but to get off the 2-year cycle. So the MARA looks at changing trends in all of these areas, and it's extremely focused, whether it's tax, whether it's how our population is changing, the aging, any of those factors in the state. And obviously federal is a huge factor that we're doing a long-term look into what funding we have coming in federal, where it goes, and its impact, not just in education, but as New Mexico mentioned, in all areas. We also put triggers into our legislative fiscal division, our finance committee that meets all summer, and while in the interims, that if federal funding's changed by an X percentage, we'd have additional meetings and resources to look at the federal changes and prepare for what to do with them. Obviously, we meant to hit those triggers. So we've got those 2 items happening. And just by happen chance, every 10 years, we do a significant relook at our education funding formula. And there's a 10-year study that's going on, and that is underway as we speak. And of course, federal is a conversation there. So we have been looking at this pretty steady. We've also started to, with all of our small school districts, as you mentioned, and little lines out there, we've within House Bill 252, the STARS Act, we created an incentive package that says if you'll share administration, we'll give you a little extra money. If you'll share bill clerks, we will. And even some of these schools that are close together with our block type scheduling, they could share a Spanish teacher or a shop teacher where 2 days in one school, 2 days in the other. And so we're trying to incentivize all of those items because while a lot of folks look to the state and assume it can just stabilize, money is a scarce resource for a state, just like it is for a federal. You have to have a source of funding to stabilize. Right now, we're in a pretty good shape in Montana, but hopefully with all of those items, we'll be, at least not be reactive. The goal is to be proactive.
Thanks for that. We've gotten a couple of different questions asking us to predict what the feds are going to do. There's one specifically about are the feds going to make these grants competitive? Or, I've heard from different states that are looking at, the possibility of the federal government gives the grants to the state and then the state distributes them down to the school districts. That's not how it works for most of these programs now. We just don't know. And I'll be honest with you, whatever I tell you, I think I know, do the opposite because I'm usually so wrong on these things. But, I think what you all are doing is what you need to do, which is just prepare, get yourself in order, and then be ready in case there are major changes or there are minor changes. I also think, Senator Solis, you brought up another really good point, which is making these changes with the U.S. Department of Education impacts communication. It also impacts data collection. And this is something from our level that we're worried about. There's a lot of information. We do these state-by-state comparisons that allow us to understand where states are at. That comes from the federal government. And there's some concern there that all the data won't be collected or won't be collected in the way it always has been because consistency is so important with that stuff. Those are really boring things, but they're important too for policy. We received one question about funding and, do states dictate that districts must distribute funds to schools in a certain way? And the answer is it's all over the map. In some cases, you mandate that states provide funding, especially Chris was talking about that we're seeing an increase in funding for low-income students and English language learners. A lot of states are saying, if we're going to give you those dollars, you have to prove to us you're spending them in the schools where the funds, where those kids are. But I'll give a shout out to Chris and his team at ECS. They have an excellent database that you can walk through and look at how every state funds English language learners, at-risk students, special education. Chris, is there any other group I'm missing in there? You have almost everything you need in there.
We also have small and sparse districts and gifted and talented programs.
Which is all very important, especially the small and sparse. Some states have both, where they fund small schools, but if you're sparse, if you're too small to exist, without this funding, then there's an extra bump in state funding for that. So I'm trying to think how we can answer people's questions when we don't have a lot of information. So is there any other thoughts you all have as we're kind of wrapping this up and coming to the end that you would say to someone that you were talking to? What can we do to prepare? What are things we need to think about? And Chris, I'll give you the last kind of go around here.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. We don't know what's going to happen at the federal level, but if these funds do get block granted, and I think there's a lot of questions we've seen in the chat around uncertainty around how the state will allocate those funds, what community-based organizations can be doing as these decisions are being made. There's an example very recently of a large infusion of federal funds that could be flexibly spent, and ESSER. And as part of the ESSER allocations, there were a lot of concerns about transparency in that process. So I think state leaders can alleviate a lot of fears by creating a very transparent process as they're determining the allocation of those federal funds if they get block granted. And an element of that was included in ESSER was that state and districts had to meaningfully engage with education stakeholders. So creating some sort of a process for how you're determining priorities and how aid is getting allocated, and being very open and transparent about to the public about those decisions, I think will go a long ways to earning trust with the public, and the public can be pushing for the opportunity to talk with state leaders about how these spending decisions are being made. So that's something that jumps to mind if we start going down that direction of black grants, where the state leaders have a lot more discretion in allocation of these federal programs.
Really good point about this kind of balance that we're always trying to do at both the federal level and the state level of providing freedom, but putting in guardrails. And one of the things I heard from ESSER over and over is that the districts liked the flexibility, but there were some who pushed back because there were decisions that were made that were questionable. And I heard about the one school district that built a football stadium. I've heard that story a million times, but this is what happens if with freedom, is that there are a lot of these choices. And as a reminder, there are 18,000 local education authorities in this country. If you give them all their own powers and freedom, someone's going to make a mistake. So it's just one of those, how do you balance that to make sure you're doing it correctly? Senator Soules, any last thoughts on this about what states can do? And
again, I think states need to pay attention to what's happening at the federal level, recognize that what happens is not just an attack on budgets or a concern about the budget, but how that affects the children in classrooms, how it affects the teachers, how it's going to affect communities, and make sure that you're trying to be proactive. As Representative Jones indicated, being proactive is being pro-armed. You're ready to move when you need to, but you don't want to think that the sky is falling. In that Federal Fund Stabilization Subcommittee, I several times said, the sky's not falling yet, but know where your hard hat is, so that if something does happen, that you're ready and prepared.
Great. And Representative Jones, I'll give you the last word here.
Yes, sir. No, proactive is key, right? That's states are often reactive. The 2-year election cycle causes that. But I truly believe that looking further ahead, being proactive, having a structured design that looks out there consistently forward, sees what's changing, sees what's coming down the pipe, does the analysis, puts together, I always call it unbiased data for as clear a look forward as possible makes all the difference. And so, and obviously having some reserves to work through it when they do occur. Things won't always be smooth. But yeah, that's been our goal as a state. My goal as an individual is to try to not be so reactive, to recognize there are disasters, there are federal changes, there are elections, there are challenges, and that money is a scarce resource. We can't just throw money at it. The taxpayer does rebel in that unless you have a unique money source, as some states do. But for the most part, proactive works, just like it does in any area. You don't wait till your roof fails to fix it. You be proactive.
It's a good point. I want to thank all of you for participating in this. Again, I'll remind you, if you've got any questions about school funding, ECS has a huge wealth of knowledge that Chris and his team have put together. We also have information on all sorts of topics on school funding, but also just about anything else within education at the Learning Policy Institute that you can tap. I want to thank Representative Jones and Senator Souls for coming in here and providing all this good advice and information. And we also want to thank our partner at NASB and our partners with ECS through all of this as we've made these different meetings and presentations. The other sessions are available online, I believe now, and this session will be available online in a few days. So if you want to go back and take a look at these, you're more than welcome to. But other than that, I'd just like to thank you all for attending our meeting and participating, and look forward to working with all of you in the future. Take care.